So the generation gap is growing. At least that's the result of a new poll that shows 70% of baby boomers think they should be the top or highest priority for the government. Compare that to younger families who say they need help and federal dollars should flow to help them. Well, what does this finding mean to the next federal budget? Are younger Canadians getting a raw deal? Joining me now is the University of British Columbia professor who sparked this debate, Paul Kershaw. Hi, Paul.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Glad you're here. So walk us through, what exactly did the poll tell you?
Well, on one hand, the poll shows us that there is widespread agreement across regions in the country and across age groups that it's become harder to raise a family today in Canada. The large majority of Canadians say household incomes are stalled for young couples, even though we're far more likely to have women employed today than we were in the 70s. And with their stalled income, young couples have to pay for housing prices that have gone up almost 76% across our country. So there's widespread agreement that it's become harder, but there's a generational gap in terms of how we should respond.
Right. I was struck by some of the things you had said about this in the release, and one of them was that how surprised you were that there was this divide, because most people you thought would want to leave a good legacy for their children.
Yeah, I've been going around the country and asking, does Canada work for all generations? And I've been assuming that part of the intergenerational tension that's emerging occurs because the boomers and those who are older than boomers weren't aware that it's become harder for young people to raise a family. But it turns out they're more than aware, but that knowledge hasn't changed their priority. As you said, 70% of Canadians 55 and older think seniors ought to be the top priority. Just 26% of Canadians over 55 think families with young kids should be a priority, and only 16% think young adults should be a priority.
So is it surprising, should we be surprised that people are most concerned about their own needs?
I think so, because if you look at the responses from Canadians under age 45, they're very different. They're saying, hey, let's look. Our standard of living is in decline, even though Canada's economy has doubled in size since 1976. So what they're asking for is a greater share of Canada's prosperity be allocated to families with young kids to remedy the fact that UNICEF says Canada is one of the worst countries when it comes to investing in policy for families with young children. Okay. But they are just as likely to say that seniors need to remain a high priority as they are to say they ought to be a high priority.
So I guess maybe our last question to you is, what was the motivation for doing this? Because clearly you're identifying a potential source of conflict where maybe we didn't know it before.
Well, I've been seeing from the economic and social data that it's become harder to raise a family and easier to retire in Canada. Not necessarily easy, but easier. And we know for those approaching retirement today, their incomes are up 18% compared to the 1970s. And poverty for seniors has been wrestled down from 29% in 1976 to less than 5% today. Right. And so clearly we have been making improvements for those who are older in their life course stages in Canada. And I just simply thought people didn't realize it was harder to raise a family today, and my job was to draw attention to that, and then once people are aware, they would adjust. But clearly now I know my job is different. People are aware, and suddenly we need to then make those who are older start to care.
Okay, well, just very quickly, what is the lesson here, or the advice that government should take from this poll?
Well, I think this is a message for Canadians generally as much as it is for governments. Either we want to be a country that once again commits to working for all generations, or we stand back and just accept the fact that we now see generations following the boomers who won't have the same standard of living. All
right. Thanks very much, Paul.
My pleasure.
It. Okay, Paul Kershaw of the University of British Columbia. So we're going to go to a commercial now and be back with two people who have differing views about this generational divide. Stay with us. Welcome back. Just before the break, we told you about a UBC study that shows the majority of baby boomers think they should be the top or highest priority for the government, while older generations feel they should take a priority. Clearly, there's a generational difference here and some strong feelings on each side. For more, we're joined by Susan Eng, who's the Vice President of Advocacy for CARP, a national seniors advocacy group, and Sandra Martin, Executive Editor of today's Parent Magazine. Hello, both of you.
Hi.
Sandra, let me start with you. What's your reaction to this new study?
Well, I actually am familiar with the study. There was a release that came out in October of this year, really looking at the fact that compared to families raising their children in the 70s, today's families are much worse off financially in terms of resources that are available to them and in terms of support. And not only that, I don't know if you covered this before the break, but $4 billion per year spent by Canadian businesses to help support this shortfall by, keeping workers, giving workers time off, lost productivity, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not just a I deserve it more than you problem. It's a problem that actually trickles over into other parts, other generations of our society.
Right. Susan, I think it's true that this generation, the older generation now, seniors, are the wealthiest generation this country has produced. Should they be the highest priority because of that, because of how much they've paid into the system?
Well, I think that it's important to recognize that they have paid into the system, and I take exception to the concern that somehow they're asking for more than their share. If they reflect some concern over what is going on in their own circumstances, I think it reflects the economic downturn of the last couple of years in particular, when the retirement savings were devastated by the market downturn. So they're not as wealthy as everybody thinks. Their ability to retire, especially for the pre-retirees, they're not so sure they're not going to have to keep working. So I think that we're getting into a level of great anxiety. I think the facts and figures give a gross generalization of what's happening, and it is true that housing prices, for example, increased dramatically over the last 10 years, but they're not going to keep going, and you can't eat your houses. So people are finding they're going to have trouble making ends meet, and I think that's some cause for anxiety, and that could explain why you got the answers that you did.
Okay. Senator, what do you think?
I'd like to jump in and say that, you can't eat your house, but you can downsize. And I'm hearing from, hardworking Canadians, and we're not talking about the spoiled brat Canadians who want to have it all right away. We've heard about our generation being the, I want it now, I want it now, I want it now generation. But I'm talking about families who work hard, who just cannot get into the housing market because, a variety of factors. Interest rates are so low, housing prices have inflated, partially because of that, partially because of inflation. They just can't get into the housing market. So they're paying money into rent that they will never get back. So I'm not saying that every retiree should downsize, but that's an option that young families don't have.